You're listening to Advancing Our Church. Welcome to Advancing Our Church, a Changing Our World podcast about Catholic stewardship, leadership, and advancement. I'm Jim Friend. Thanks for downloading our podcast today. As we come off of National Vocations Awareness Week, on behalf of all of us at Changing Our World and especially the Advancing Our Church podcast, we want to extend a special thanks to all those men and women who accepted a vocation to the priesthood, diaconate, or religious life. These are not easy times for someone to say yes to a vocation in a public way. And yet, thanks be to God, so much good would not be done in our world today if it were not for men and women around the world who said yes to their vocation. And we ask you to say a prayer for Vocations Week, not only for these men and women, but also for those family members of those men and women who are considering a vocation. Way back at the beginning of my podcast in episode 4, I interviewed Monsignor Andy Baker, who is the Vocations Director at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Maryland. I remember Monsignor telling me that it was his family members who made it comfortable for him and his brother to say yes to their vocation. So don't underestimate the influence that you may have on the vocations crisis today. Recruitment starts at home with an openness to have that dialogue. I encourage you to go back and listen to episode 4 if you're so inclined. Now, let's get to work. So let's talk with someone else who is advancing the mission of our church today, Mrs. Julianne Stanz. Julianne is an accomplished author, speaker, and a consultant for the USCCB. But most of the time, you can find Julianne in her home diocese of Green Bay, where she leads the evangelization efforts for Bishop David Ricken. I interviewed Julianne about her latest book last week, and it's called Start with Jesus. And I think you'll learn a lot in this interview about parish life, evangelization, and really meeting people where they're at today. And so, without further ado, here is Julianne Stanz. Well, we're here with Julianne Stanz, the author of Start with Jesus. Julianne, it's great to be with you again today.
Thank you, Jim. It's lovely to be with you and all your listeners, too.
Now, I was thinking the first time that we met, we were in the Archdiocese of Miami at a stewardship conference. And ironically, we were both working in the Diocese of Green Bay at the time. So instead of coming across the parking lot, we went down to Miami for our first meeting. But we had you on the podcast then. You were the keynote speaker at the stewardship conference. And congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. It's been great. The stewardship conference in Miami was a wonderful opportunity. It was focused on family faith formation and how we can help our families grow in faith. And I made reference actually to the book a couple of times when I was down in Miami just because I was so excited about it. But it's finally here. It was released just a couple of weeks ago. And by all accounts, it seems to be doing well, which is great.
Congratulations. So, Julianne, before we talk about your book, which I absolutely want to talk about, and I did read it, how do you start as a parish youth minister, go into religious education, and then wind up years later at the Convocation for Catholic Bishops as the MC? I mean, what an amazing journey you've been on. I'd just love to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know is the answer to that. Only God knows, because I often tell people that if I had my way, I would be home in Ireland in my own village and I'd be working somewhere in Ireland. But I kind of had a life-changing encounter with our Lord actually when I was about 16 or 17, and I climbed what's called Ireland's holiest mountain. It was Patrick, and I just had this moment that clearly came from the Holy Spirit because it wasn't even a thought in my head. And as the sun was going down and we had climbed for hours up this mountain, I just remember saying to God, you know, how amazing it is to see sunrises and sunsets, and God's love is like that. It comes up, and it comes up every day for us, whether we see it or not. And that was the thought that went through my head. And then the next thing was, Lord, you know, my life is in your hands wherever you go. I actually said, you know, wherever you blow my sails, I will row my boat. Mm-hmm. And so I was working in Mater Dei, which is actually now it was a seminary. At the time, it was intaking lay students for theology, and I was teaching first-year theology students, and I had them in religious ed as I was coming out of a master's and going into a PhD program. And I decided to take a career break, essentially, kind of a sabbatical, because I had been studying for a long period of time, and went to a professor, a really bright man, and said, you know, I think I've spent a lot of time in the academic world of the church. And he said, yeah, you know, you kind of want to see the world and explore. He was very wise and said, why don't you just get out there? And I said, where will I find a job? He said, just go down to the notice board. There's jobs coming in from all over the world looking for religion teachers. And so I went down, and there was a job for a very, very small little parish in northern Wisconsin. And I took that for a year. Then a year became 3, and 3 became the day I met my husband, and I've been here ever since. But I came over, interestingly enough. I thought I was coming over to teach second grade religion in a Catholic school, and I was. But at the same time, I learned that they had a need for a director of religious education. And I didn't really know what that was, because we don't have religious education programs in Ireland. Our schools are fully funded, and so religious education is part of the ethos of all state schools. And that's changed a little bit now, but at the time, I didn't even have a framework for what a religious ed director did or a catechist did. And so I literally jumped into it with, I would say, not my eyes wide open, but fully with 2 feet flying behind me. And then, you know how this goes in parish life. The youth minister quits, and I picked up doing youth ministry and did youth ministry and religious education and was a catechist. And then RCIA needed some attention, and I was working. So I got to work like a lot of areas of parish life. And then took a job working in a boarding school for a while. That's where I met my husband, and then came back into ministry again here in the Diocese of Green Bay. And Bishop Zubik was the bishop that actually hired me. And so in the same conversation that he hired me, he also told me that he was getting moved and he wouldn't have an opportunity to work with me. But he said, enjoy Green Bay. So I've worked for Bishop Ricken and served the parishes here ever since then.
And your current position here in the diocese?
That's a great question. It's
evolving.
It has evolved. Yeah, I started off Director of Adult Faith Formation, and then I did Adult Faith Formation with Young Adult Ministry. And then probably most people know me, I became Director of New Evangelization and started talking about that. Then I went and I did Director of Discipleship and Leadership Development, which was an incredible experience for me. I got to learn a whole other area of church life in terms of leadership development and coaching teams. And now I'm Director of Parish Life and Evangelization, which I think feels the best fit from all of the experiences, at least at this point.
Sure. And you also sit on a committee with Bishop Barron and our mutual friend Bishop Barris. And tell us a little bit about that committee.
Yeah, so I was invited about 8.5 years ago to serve as a consultant on the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis. And our current chairman is Bishop Barron, who's, word on fire. He's very, very well known throughout the country. And a lot of the work that I do for the U.S. bishops in terms of consultancy work is I do some writing. I give opinions and editorial commentary on things. I work with them on the project that we spent a lot of time working on as consultants was the document Living as Missionary Disciples, which articulated a new framework for discipleship for essentially the whole country, and it was a response to Pope Francis's document Evangelii Gaudium. And I was involved in resourcing, writing, kind of helping with the framework around that, and then the entire committee gets involved and kind of takes their knives to it and kind of pares it down and starts again. And it was a really fascinating project. And so that's been out about a year now, which is great. But last year, I think 2 years ago, again, not sure quite how this happened, but the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops called a gathering together. And it was the last time that the bishops called a gathering like this was in 1917. And they gathered leaders from all over the country to talk about kind of like the signs of the times and what was going on in this postmodern world and how we speak faith into this culture. And I was the MC along with Bishop Burns from Dallas. Mm-hmm. And we had a lot of fun. It was nerve-wracking. I'm not even going to...
It's a huge gathering.
Huge.
Unprecedented, really.
Yeah, 5,000 leaders from, I remember reading the script, from as far away as the Marshall Islands to Maine. And I think 180 bishops were there and several of the cardinals. And they were, we had lay folk and we had religious and deacons and bishops and cardinals all speaking and paneling together. And so I got to MC a lot of that and really got to see a lot of the behind the scenes of what goes into an experience like that. But the whole impetus of that was really to respond to Pope Francis as the joy of the gospel. And what does that mean for us here? And one of the comments that the nuncio, Archbishop Christophe Pierre, said to the American church, which I think would be fascinating for your listeners, is, the great hope of Catholicism right now, a large seed of that is in the Americas. And there's this great spirit of generosity and entrepreneurship around starting apostolates and things like that. And being strong, altruistic presence in the community, but beyond that, sharing the light of the gospel. And so he really fired up the Church of the Americas for mission, which was just beautiful too.
So a couple of months ago, I was in the Diocese of Camden. I was at the convocation, by the way, a couple of years ago. It was amazing. You did an amazing job as MC. But we were with the Diocese of Camden, and they were also at the convocation. Yeah. And what they took from it is they mirrored it at the local diocese. So they had their own local convocation in South Jersey. Have you seen that kind of replication happening around the country, or what do you think were the results of the convocation?
That's a great question, because I was talking with Donna, I'm going to pronounce her name terribly, Ottaviana Britt, and she was responsible. She was the MC for the convocation in Camden, and she and I corresponded before, and we talked. But I actually spoke at that conference with her just to kind of bring some of the elements of what happened in Orlando into the local diocese and archdiocese and kind of flow throughout that side of the country. And what really impressed me about the local conference was a sincere effort to really enculturate what that conference wanted to do in a local sense and really grapple with mission for parishes. So grapple with local issues, grapple with the issues that were most pressing in Camden, and really look at a framework and a structure to look at that. I thought it was one of the best local initiatives that I have ever seen. I mean, it was just incredible. It kind of used a synodal process where people were brought together on teams, and then they led the convocation that they led wasn't just a kind of a one and done, but people gathered and read documents and set forth expectations and ideas, and that was incredible. I've seen a similar process roll out throughout the United States in various parts of the country. I just spoke to the Diocese of Crookston, Fargo. They collaborate together, and how fired up they were to do some work around the convocation. And I know that they have drawn the work of the convocation into their learnings with their parishes. But, if you go down to Texas, or you're out in LA, in California, and you go to the different regions like the San Gabriel Valley, the pastors there that attended the convocation are looking at reaching out anew. So it was a moment of great hope, but I think it also gave people some practical underpinnings that they could center their work in. And I'm seeing inklings of that continue to grow. I think the work of that is probably going to, I think we always think it's going to happen and bam, we're going to actualize the work within a year. But I think it's going to be, at least 5 to 8 years where we see the effects of that movement kind of throughout the country and the impact that it had.
Sure. Do you think we'll see another convocation sometime in the future?
Well, at one of the U.S. bishops' gatherings, or one of the meetings we had, there was a lot of talk about the convocations. If this went so well, we should plan another one. And I just remember
a groan throughout the audience.
I was like, oh, gosh, because it was so much intense work. But people came back so energized by it that I think, 100 years is definitely too long.
Yeah. That's a reasonable time frame, right?
Yeah, we move slow, but it shouldn't be that slow.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about your book. Tell us a little bit what inspired you to write it, and who are you when you think of your audience for the book? Who's the audience?
Well, that's a great question. I think part of what inspired me to write the book was actually around the convocation and helping parishes to move into a more missionary framework outlook in their ministries. And so at first I thought, I'm going to write this book for people who are on parish councils, finance committees, your trustees, your catechists, people who are already engaged in the life of the church but need some hope and renewal around their part to play. And at a time in the church where a lot of people are leaving, the message that I wanted to kind of come through the book was don't leave, but lead and step forward to lead the church that you love for Jesus Christ. And then I wrote it, I think I began on March 9th and I finished on June 23rd. It just literally poured out of me. And then I sat on it for a bit. And then as I spoke to some folks about it, and in fact, I spoke to people like my own husband, who his really only point of contact with the Catholic Church is at Sunday Mass. And I thought, what can I have him read that helps him understand his role as a baptized member of the Church in terms of what that looks like as missionary discipleship? How do I help him understand that? Because unless he's going to classes or getting some formation, he's not. That conversation is kind of bypassing him. So I went back and I kind of broadened the audience for the book. It's a book that I can hand my husband, who has no ministerial or theological formation, and he can understand, okay, at baptism, the wellspring of discipleship comes from that sacrament. And as it grows, you're responsible, you're co-responsible in terms of leading for the church you love. And then I thought about our catechists, who are the backbone of our church, our funeral lunch ladies. And so I wanted to put something in everybody's hands that was very simple. So the title of it is Start with Jesus, but then the subtitle is How Everyday Disciples Can Renew the Church. Because I want people to feel that in their simple, ordinary, extraordinary witness, that they can renew the church that they love too, starting at their parish. And that's why the whole focus of the book is around renewing our parishes.
And in the book you say it's really less about programs, but more about process, people, and culture. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think culture is something that we've started to talk about in our parishes, especially here in the Diocese of Green Bay. But what is the culture of your parish and how is that shaped? And recently somebody said, culture is shaped by what you celebrate and what you tolerate. And so there's an analogy I use in the book, and it's a very human one. But I remember first coming to the United States, and I started eating all the lovely food that's here. And I just remember having this moment like 2 months later, where I tried to put on my jeans and they wouldn't button. And just like...
We've all been there.
Yeah, we've all been there. That kind of unnoticed weight loss kind of crept up on me. It didn't happen overnight. And so I think we want to look at the issues that we are facing in the Catholic Church with the lens of, it only happened in the last 10 years or 20 years or Vatican II or whatever. But the seed of what's happened in the Church in terms of renewal has been a steady, incremental series of changes. And our culture is shaped by that. So really grappling with the culture is really important. And then one of the metaphors that I use in terms of focusing on people that's Jesus's methodology. Jesus used a very simple process to form those that he walked with. And we have a very, very programmatic response to discipleship and catechesis. And so I use this image a lot. I think when we look at parish renewal, we think it's like baking a cake. And you can't really tinker too much with a recipe for a cake before it goes wrong. And so we've taken the recipe of what's worked at one parish and we've tried to graft it onto our own parish without being attentive to the local culture. And yeah, there's things we can learn. But what I want to suggest to parishes is that your culture is more like a stew. And that's a very Irish word, or a casserole if you're in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. But when you open your refrigerator, what goes into that stew is determined by what you have on hand. And so the culture of your parish is often determined by the people and the processes that you already have in place. And that is your best resource and your best way of charting a missionary path forward. And so the book sets up simple ideas parishes can do, but it really tries to move them beyond just tweaks into really looking at some large-scale changes that their parishes can make.
That makes so much sense, because in so many things that we do, we talk about best practices, but the best practice that works in one parish may not work at another parish. The dynamic is different, the culture is different. Sometimes it doesn't work from state to state or from town to town. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I think also, the name of your parish, I make this point too, but the name of your parishes should tell a little story about what people can expect to feel in your parish. So, the St. Catherine Drexel should feel different than perhaps, Saints Peter and Paul. And so I tell parishes to tap into their best resources, which is their people. And the metaphor that I use as well, I use a lot of them because I'm Irish and we tell stories a lot.
You're a great storyteller.
Is that conversion is a process which happens from the inside out. And I believe that parish renewal will also happen from the inside out by renewing our people first. And I think we've tried to renew from the outside in, and it's less effective because the culture will always eat the strategy. And you hear that expression a lot, culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch.
Right.
But if you can look at the culture that you have and the people that you have in place, then you can make better decisions in the light of the gospel to start with Jesus. And so it's very centered on the person of Jesus and what he did in terms of changing the culture, because he was the master at it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he took the dominant culture of the day and he really turned it on its head. He knew when to use the culture effectively, and maybe uses the wrong word, but he knew when to baptize the culture for Christianity, and when to walk with the culture, and then when to call out the culture, and then when to upend the culture and throw a few tables over. But he was a master at looking at the culture he already had, and then activating the gifts of core disciples that he could walk with. And that's a much longer and larger process than running a programmatic model, which is event-driven, and as soon as a more glamorous or flashy event comes along, your people will go to that. So,
right.
Yeah.
And Jesus was also so good at getting to know people, too, and getting to know their gifts. And I guess what I'm hearing you say is that's part of this process, getting to know the people in your parish, eliciting those gifts and getting them engaged.
Oh, for sure. I really believe that our best gift in our parishes is our people. I mean, the gift of the Eucharist is it's so personal. And I have a quote that I've used several times. If Eucharist is the heart of your parish, then prayer is the heartbeat. And being in dialogue with people, learning their stories, praying with them, having them share their struggles in the light of the gospel, that's the sweet spot for many of our parishes. But it's more time intensive. It moves slower, because it moves at the pace of the other person. And very much, I think sometimes our parishes are set up to reflect who we want people to be versus where people really are at.
Makes so much sense. So Julianne, in your book, you say, becoming familiar with the kerygma is essential to us all, but especially to our parish teams, so that it can be woven into the tapestry of parish life. Tell me about that word, kerygma. Am I pronouncing that?
You are, yeah,
right?
kerygma.
Yeah.
So the kerygma is the Greek word that means to proclaim or herald. And in every tradition around the world, you have this idea of like the town crier. I mean, think about like the birth of, I think it's Archer, the newest little prince of Prince Harry and Meghan. They still announced his birth with a town crier on a scroll. But town criers are found everywhere from Massachusetts to the Congo. Like sharing news, announcing news is a part of who we are. And the kerygma is a fancy word for saying to proclaim or herald, but it's the nugget, it's the core. I often describe it to kids, for example, as the pop, as the kernel that goes pop.
Yeah.
Pope Francis says that unless we proclaim the kerygma, all aspects of our evangelization and discipleship work are going to be sterile, because the foundation isn't there. The kerygma is the initial ardent proclamation by which somebody is overwhelmed and brought to faith in Jesus Christ. And it's the basic story. It's not doesn't have all the elements of it. It has the core message of salvation. And in the Diocese of Green Bay, we use a very simple 5-part framework. We talk about creation, and God is love and has created me for relationship with him. And then there's the fall. I've broken my relationship with God through my sin. And then, so it's creation, fall, and then there's the redemption and salvific action, where Jesus Christ comes to save us, and then Jesus Christ offers us this new life as a pathway to eternal happiness and life. And then the last is the recreation. The Holy Spirit is poured into us. If you look at, for example, how the Bible is structured, if you look at, for example, the Acts of the Apostles even, you'll find very, very clear snapshots of kerygmatic proclamation, where people were told this good news. And this good news was the foundation before all the other news was shared, before all the other teachings was shared. And they come to realize, God loves me. After everything I've done, I can have this new life. And so it's unless we get to grips, and unless I think that kerygma is embedded in all of our parish activities, I think we're going to continue to teach and catechize people who don't have that foundation in place and aren't ready for the message. And in fact, the studies would all bear that out. Many Catholics, for example, don't believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Right.
So talking to them about what is the Eucharist and why Jesus lived and died, and bringing the Eucharist into that can be very powerful for people. I found that I was talking about the kerygma, and a lady stood up, "You're making this way too complicated." And I said to her, "Well, how would you share the kerygma?" And she said, very simple. I was, God did, I am. So I'll repeat that again. I was, God did, I am. But what she said was, I was, and she described what her life was like, and she used the words hot mess there, and made us all chuckle, and then said, this is what God did for me in those moments. And then I am, and this is how I am now. It's really the word we would use is the Paschal mystery. It's the dying, the rising, to life, to new life in Jesus Christ. That's the kerygma. It's a word that Pope Francis has been using a lot. And so this recovery of the kerygma is really new for us, I think, in terms of what it looks like in our parishes.
Beautiful explanation. Julianne, when you spoke at ICSC as the keynote maybe a year ago or so, a year and a half ago, and I think also you went over this when you were in Miami, you talked about some of our programs don't necessarily penetrate the folks in the pews because we expect that their level of education or understanding of the faith is at a level that they may not be at yet. And so when you look at, your book, as I read through it, seems to have something in it for everybody. Like, where does a pastor get started these days when he looks at a congregation, a community that is at all different kinds of levels in their education and formation as disciples of Christ?
It's a great question. I think we do really well as a Catholic Church with our catechesis and our faith formation and our educational initiatives. But what we're realizing is that most of our folks are in pre-evangelization, which means that they have not had a significant encounter with the Lord that they can articulate. And so it's awakening and reawakening of those folks in their faith. And I would tell a pastor, if you look at your parish, for example, and you look at where your resources are from a personnel standpoint, from a financial standpoint, they're oriented to presume that most people are in a further stage of formation than they actually are. And so, the classic case of they went through the RCIA program and why aren't they here a year later? Or, they went through sacramental prep to have their children baptized and we don't see them 6 months later. It's a sure sign that the programs that we have in place are not oriented to where people actually are. And so I would say to the pastors that are listening and their staff is to start with Jesus. Look at what Jesus did. Move away from one-time event. You have to do some social work, meaning social events and things like that, as a kind of a way to build people and to engage them. But there really isn't a strategy for engagement of a person that comes in with zero understanding of their faith and take them through a discipleship process. It kind of happens haphazardly in the parish, in a sense, And so kerygmatic homilies, addressing the question of so what for your parishioners. So what difference does this make to my life? Strengthening opportunities for prayer. What's really interesting is if you look at research on the culture and where we're at and the high levels of anxiety and depression in the culture, prayer and mindfulness is the huge thing. Well, Catholics we've had mindfulness part and parcel of our tradition without calling it that for 2,000 years. It's by having the Lord speak to us in prayer, by being attuned to his presence. It's providing those kinds of opportunities, but telling people that's what they are for, not just presuming that people know what they're for. So I would say to pastors, start there. Start with what Jesus did, how he formed his disciples, and then reorient your parish to that. I give 3 hinge points, if you will, for pre-evangelization. Healing, hope, and hospitality. For folks like my husband who are in an early stage of their faith,